Hello, here we are once again at Theology 333, the African American Religious Experience. I'm Dr. Jones, and we're going to have another lecture series today. Today we're going to look at some anti-slavery and abolitionist churches. We're going to talk about the theory behind that, and we're going to begin by a short overview of what's going on in the context of the country at this time. This is kind of like pre-Civil War. We're looking at some of the conversations that are going on with that and some of the great leadership that's taken place in American culture, American society, given the context of addressing the issue of slavery. The overview of American culture and society that we'll be looking at today, we need to remember, for example, the difference between the industrial textile northern states and the agricultural and plantation kind of driven southern states in America at this particular time. In the southern states, for example, we see the South primarily providing cotton and tobacco and sugar and off their plantations and other kind of agricultural crops to the North. The southern states were labor intensive, concentrating on slave labor capitalism and low tariff to create the cotton kingdom that we know about and have heard about so often. That material that was produced in the southern states basically went to the textile rich and industrial rich northern states, and the industrialized north manufactured goods and generated wealth off the textile goods and material of the South. So you have the southern states creating the material. You have the northern states manufacturing the goods off of the material. Everyone in the United States was getting wealthy and rich off of the slave trade market and the slave trade capitalism that was taking place in terms of slave labor. We need to understand that this country became wealthy off of that kind of partnership that happened for many years. Part of the problem with the Civil War is the aristocratic South, for example, wanted sovereignty in relationship to how they generated their wealth, and the industrialized North wanted to have more control over the tariffs and the material that the southern states were producing. And in fact, when we talk about the Civil War, as opposed to the popular notion that it was because of race, it was an economic issue that was taking place between the South and the North in relationship to tariffs and the development of wealth. It was an economic struggle. Okay, there were three different churches. I talked to you about this before. There are three different churches that we have looked at that are starting to form up institutionally at this time in the African American community. The community church, as we've talked about several times, is the church that is very parochial. It's basically coming out of the South, and it's basically serving its own issue. It's working in the context of survival theology, and basically it's just dealing with the issues of resistance, liberation, and survival in the context of slavery. We also talked about the mainstream churches. The mainstream churches in the northern states are very organized. They're focusing on wealth and education. They're focusing on becoming mainstream, becoming like mainstream American culture, American society. There's not much struggle to deal with the issues of slavery. It's more about the business of how do I fit in? How do I fit in? But the church that I want us to look at today, and we're going to deal with today, is the Advocacy Church, which we'll focus on this lecture. Remember, I told you the Advocacy Church is a very unusual church. It's built on the issues of the day. And the issue of the day in American culture, American society, in this context, in this pre-Civil War context, is slavery and the abolition of slavery. So we have an advocacy church forming around the issue of slavery and anti-slavery movement, if you will, an anti-slavery church, if you will. It is multicultural. It is multi-class. There are liberals in the church. There are conservatives in the church. All have one common denominator. They all are against slavery. It's a social justice environment, milieu. The Advocacy Church becomes the abolitionist church in the pre-Civil War period. The justice issue of the day is slavery, and the struggle in terms of policy has to do with pro-slavery states and anti-slavery states, and eventually it divides the country, and we see the development of the Civil War. In talking about the abolition of slavery, we must focus on a couple of key characters, if you will, key individuals, leadership in this area, and one of the most noteworthy is Frederick Douglass and his work in terms of abolitionists as well as an anti-slavery orator and speaker. He brings a unique kind of focus into the life of the anti-slavery movement when Frederick Douglass comes upon the scene, and we'll talk about that. But we also need to look at a gentleman by the name of William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was born in 1805. He died in 1879, and he was one of the leading abolitionists of the time. He was head of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and he was the founding editor of The Liberator, and an abolitionist newspaper. The Liberator is an abolitionist newspaper. Wendell Phillips is another individual that was, a European, born November 29th, 1811. He died February 2nd, 1884. He was an abolitionist, advocate for Native Americans, and he was a lawyer. But we want to focus in on the development of national black leadership. And the reason why we need to do that is because Frederick Douglass is one of the, singularly, one of the more prominent individuals that not only has national recognition, but he also has recognition on the international level. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in February 1818, and he died in Washington, D.C. in February 20th, 1895. He was born at Talbot County, Maryland, and he lived with, for many years of his young life, he lived with Hugh Alt in Baltimore. After he was born in Maryland, he moved to Baltimore. He was given to Hugh Alt. Hugh Alt was a carpenter on a ship, on a sailing ship, and Hugh Alt and his wife taught Frederick how to read. He began to learn his letters, and he began to find his way. And so his first lessons in terms of learning how to read came from Hugh Alt. He didn't stay long there. He was an escaped slave. He was an abolitionist. He self-taught. He got a hold of something called the Columbian Orator, which is basically a book of letters, and he began to teach himself. And once he had the direction given to him, he began to self-teach himself how to read, how to write, and how to speak. He wrote 3 autobiographies. He's the author and editor of the North Star, which was the first black abolitionist national newspaper. His first autobiography was intended as an anti-slavery tract, published in the Boston Office Anti-Slavery Society in the spring of 1845. It was prefaced by William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, and it was a written letter also added to it by Wendell Phillips. He also wrote My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855, and he updated his experiences with the life and times of Frederick Douglass in 1881 and 1892. His first work, however, is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. It is used most often in teaching people about the issue of education and how education is connected toward freedom. Douglass was inspired to write and publish his own anti-slavery paper, the North Star, and it was published December 3rd, 1847 in Rochester, New York. Douglass published his first edition of the North Star and merged with the Liberty Party paper later on and renamed that paper the Frederick Douglass paper. So he was a prolific writer. He wrote primarily about anti-slavery issues, and he dealt with the issues of slavery and the freedom of African-American people. He also traveled to Europe. He traveled over the world, speaking against America as it relates to the horrific issues of slavery. One of the things that Frederick says is power, one of his quotes is, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will, unquote. He also said, America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. And he was speaking in relationship to slavery. And we're coming up on the eve of Independence Day. And what Frederick Douglass essentially said is that for the African in America, there is no Independence Day because we still are slaves. We still are being treated as less than human. And so he was very vocal and very strong in his outcry against slavery. And this was very unusual during pre-Civil War times for him to speak that. There's also an issue with him and John Brown. John Brown was a radical white who felt that armed struggle needed to ensue against slavery, and some connection to John Brown made Frederick Douglass be a fugitive in the United States because of his relationship to John Brown, and they thought that he was conspiratorial in terms of his participation in John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry, and so that's a famous kind of connection that we see. And so Frederick actually flees the country for a while and speaks internationally on the issue of slavery. The Advocacy Church, let's talk a little about that. The Advocacy Church was the church that combined the aspirations toward justice of enslaved African Americans, liberal and radical Europeans who were against slavery, and free African Americans who fought for change in American society. Frederick Douglass was one of the first international African Americans who voiced his rejection of American values that at the time enforced and benefited from slave labor capitalism and the slave trade. There were others who were militant as well, and we'll be talking about those individuals, but I want you to key in on Frederick Douglass. When the lion wrote history, as Wendell Phillips puts it, this individual was of tremendous value to the uplifting of the dignity and the self-worth and the personhood of African Americans throughout America and the Caribbean and even in the world. He was very articulate. He was so articulate that people questioned whether or not he was actually ever a slave. But this was a self-taught man that had literally pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and essentially addressed this issue. And for his entire life, he struggled against slavery. He helped to encourage, as we'll see in the Civil War, the development of what we would call Negro regiments. We'll see the Fighting 54th. We'll talk a little about that in terms of the Civil War as we move through the Civil War into Reconstruction. But Frederick Douglass is the first national African American leader that speaks out vocally and publicly against slavery. He also is a writer. He continues to put forth his particular perspective in the face of this context of slavery. And we see a continuing evolution of what we would call the black national or radical perspective as it relates to slavery coming through this abolitionist church. Now, this church is a very unusual church. This church is made up of Quakers. This church is made up of Mennonites. This church is made up of abolitionists, people who are willing to put themselves at risk to deal with the issue of slavery. When we talk about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, part of the success of the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman had to do with the Advocacy Church, the abolitionist church, the anti-slavery church, if you will, that essentially is putting together opportunities for slaves to have safe places as they move toward Canada, move toward freedom places. They are helping slaves run from the South to the North, and they are helping with passes and false IDs and all other things that they need to do in order to make this freedom for these people possible. Now, we want to thank the people who put themselves in harm's way in order to make slavery be dismantled in American culture, American society. But we cannot forget the importance of the tremendous vocal leadership that is being given at that time to this horrific issue of slavery in America. We want to look at, the reason why we need to look at Frederick Douglass and the Advocacy Church, because it's very different than what we would normally understand a church to be. This church is bounded and built on conflict, on the issue of social justice, on bringing justice to bear. This Advocacy Church still exists today. If you look at places like Community Renewal Society, or if you look at the NAACP or the Urban League, or if you look at the American Jewish Federation, or any organization that gathers people of all races, age, genders, classes together to deal with the issues of justice, then you're looking at the Advocacy Church. On next time, what we're going to look at is some of the leaders that rise up into this radical religiosity, if you will, begin to question more and more the American culture, American society as it relates. We'll look at Bishop Henry Turner out of the AME Church. We'll look at Alexander Crumnell and Martin Delaney and others who are beginning to rise up and write about and begin to speak nationally about this issue of slavery and fair treatment of African Americans. We'll see you next time.